very, very important presentations on quality of testing as a prerequisite to food safety, public health, trade and economic development in the region. I want to echo one sentiment that was made by NWISA CEO that we need to develop products for ourselves. And we have capacity. We need to leverage on the capacity that is already there. We start moving. Because if we say we don't have capacity, we keep on building capacity without doing anything. There were very important presentations like approaches for micro method validation, being very important in ensuring quality of test results. So this morning session will be focusing on the fundamentals of testing, how to ensure good and sustained analytical methods performance. But before I invite the first speaker, I have a few announcements to make. One, our Biofarm will have a workshop on mycotoxin analysis on Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 p.m. in the Pogola room. Registration is free. You can sign up at the our Biofarm stand. Another announcement, Microsoft will also have a workshop on analytical methods on Wednesday afternoon from 2:30 p.m. in the Pogola room. Also, registration is free. You can sign up at the Microsoft stand or in the Pompo room. I want to inform you that there is a charging station on the right corner at the end there, where you can charge your phone in one compartment. You can lock, your phone will be safe there and charging. The game drive will be at 3 p.m. You are reminded to keep time. We'll be at reception at 3. Okay, I want to invite our first presenter this morning, Professor Simi Dube. Will be presenting on fundamentals of testing, how to ensure good and sustained analytical methods performance. Professor Simiso is currently the head of teaching, learning and community engagement in the College of Science, Engineering and Technology at the University of South Africa, UNISA. Prior to this administrative position, she worked as an associate professor in the chemistry department in the field of analytical chemistry. Her research interest is in developing green sample preparation methods, separation science, especially liquid chromatographic and electro-driven separation methods. The developed analytical methods have been applied in food analysis and environmental analysis, especially in determination of emerging contaminants in aquatic environments. She has published work in peer-reviewed journals and has supervised 9 masters and 9 PhD students out of this field. Recently, Professor Dube has gained interest in fabrication of nanomaterials from biopolymers extracted from plants, which are applied for sample preparation and for the removal of emerging pollutants in water. Prof. Dube is also a board member of SINAC, that's African Network of Analytical Chemists. She has a special interest in community engagement for the improvement of communities and has served the College of Science and Technology at UNISA as a chairperson of community engagement for a period of more than 8 years. At this point, I wish to welcome her to make the presentation.
Good morning, colleagues. When I came this morning, I thought, oh, I still have time to think about my presentation because I thought I was the third person, only to realize that presenter number 1 is recapping about what I missed yesterday, and presenter number 2 has changed with me. But anyway, that's all good. As I have been introduced, I'm Simiso Dube, and I'm actually Simiso Dube Nindi. Professor Nindi is my husband, who has been with you in the audience yesterday. And when he was actually invited to come and give a talk, he was supposed to travel to Mauritius. And without necessarily informing me, he's communicated with Ephraim here and said, I cannot make it, but there's Inaugural who can present. So I said, I mean, you know my admin work, I cannot present because I'm supposed to be a Senate. This morning I'm supposed to be doing program reviews. But that's good, we're all here. And I really appreciate the organizing committee for inviting me. And from where I'm sitting, I was like, what exactly do they want me to do? Because I teach these things at a lower level and I haven't been teaching for a long time. The audience, what is it? You know, when you go to a conference, you want to talk about your research and share your own findings. And yeah, it's like fundamentals of testing. Yeah, but that's a very not nice topic. I don't want to talk about that. But I was like, okay, fine. I think we need to have a conversation, and I hope I don't bore anyone because I just decided I will actually have the topic as presented to me, and I hope actually I just share just this. Why is it very important for us actually to do testing, and why should we actually ensure that the testing that we're doing is actually giving us what we desire, like the fitness of papers, and why should we actually ensure that the analytical methods or the tools that we have are performing that well and they give us that data that we actually require. I suppose in the food discipline where we are actually faced with all sorts of pollutants. We have all sorts of challenges. We've got, I've just listed just some of the examples of the things that we struggle with. We have different types of contaminants, chemical contaminants. We have also other types of contaminants, microbial contaminants as well. So this is a range of what we deal with in the food industry. You can list, you know, all the antibiotics that are actually used for growth promoters, for other things that actually are in there. But the other issue that we now, we have interest on microtoxins. We also have now mixed contaminants. We have pesticides, we have microtoxins in the matrix. You have, antibiotics as well, which are used in the veterinary products. So we are challenged with all these, and these are very complex chemicals in that they've got diverse properties. They've got diverse properties. They are in a very complex matrix, be it the milk matrix, be it your cereals, or be it the meat that you're actually consuming. So we are actually having a challenge of coming with methods that we know that perform well to give us what we actually claim to have. And in an analytical method, obviously, when we talk to our students, we say there are things that you need to focus on. You need to actually be able to ensure that you've prepared your sample properly. Because if you miss the sample preparation, you can claim things that are not actually true, and then you can mislead people because your sample preparation, maybe you change the integrity of your analyte, or you change the integrity of the sample. So that step is always very critical. We are seeing quite a number of technical methods that are allowing us to separate the analytes from the matrix, and for us to be able to detect it at a certain level. And then, of course, we don't end there. So method development becomes an issue or a big thing for us. Some of the methods that we have, of course, there are standards that have tested them elsewhere, that people can actually come and say, this is the standard that is available. Examples that are actually on the AOAC, maybe database of what has been validated and stuff like that, so you can extract that. But in some cases, we have to develop new methods. So if we have to develop new methods, we need to actually look at things that are very critical or that we should consider for us as we develop, and then we want to test before we apply them we have to ensure that the method that we say we've tested, we've developed, does work. Hence, there's so much I saw in the presentation yesterday. I was like, so where do I start and where do I end? Because I see validation of this, validation of this. So I'm seeing there's a lot of validation that is actually discussed. And for me, that's part of the fundamentals, that the methods that are actually being used are validated. And at times in the we are working in different environments where we are actually now assuming, oh, maybe the people that are actually going through a validation process are the invited labs, in collaborative testing, or maybe there is a group that will actually validate. But all laboratories have to actually have an understanding of why we have to validate, when do we have to validate, and how we should actually validate, which is why I actually thought we can maybe pause and think about the other aspects of this. So I will then go back to sample preparation. Sample preparation, of course, we've got vast techniques that are there, which some of the methods are old methods that we've used and they've been validated and tested, and they show that they're actually performing. For instance, we have the liquid extraction, which is found in all methods, standard methods that are actually out there. Solid phase extraction, even the dispersive solid phase extraction, that are actually methods that are available. And then, of course, as we live in the greener environment, we try to move and say what the liquid extraction methods can do. Maybe there are other ways of doing that. But then that speaks of, if we were to engage and look at these methods, we have to validate them before we actually sell them to anybody to say they actually give us the same information that we design. So you'll find that in the literature, and maybe for us who are researchers, we look at because we are not just testing, we are developing methods. So we have to come up with new ideas of things, instead of using volumes of toxic solvents, why don't I cut my solvent consumption, which I can also dispose of very well, and then consider these micro liquid extraction methods. So these, which I've listed there, are examples of where we're using microliters to extract the same components from the matrix and actually be able to come to the data which we want to actually work on. But before we can sell this, before we can actually take them anyway and say this is coming from the research work to being applied in the lab, it means there's a lot of work in terms of the validation that needs to take place for them to be actually trusted by standards, or for them to have been sent out for proficiency testing, as we'll actually talk about, and people buy in and say, yes, indeed, they are methods of interest. And then we have the catchers, of course, that we actually have that are now out in standard methods that we can use. So that's the sample preparation. So the sample preparation on its own, as you develop that, it means that that sample preparation, when you develop it, of course you would have found optimum conditions. There are ways of optimizing, but also you would have actually validated that method. That sample preparation method has to be validated if it's a new method. So you validate it, and then of course you compare it to the existing standards for its actually performance. So that's one component of the analysis, or that actually happens in the lab. And then we have, of course, I've just listed all sorts of various analytical tools that we can actually come up with. So these are standard methods that people have used in different labs. So you find there are various techniques that we can actually use, but that choice of a technique needs to actually be fit for purpose for that type of an analysis, for that matrix that you're working on, for the results that maybe your customer is actually interested in. So am I choosing the right tool? I might be working in a range where people want me to be using a very sensitive method like the LC-MS. So am I in that space, or am I training things with a method that is not necessarily capable of detecting to that low level? So I need to actually get that information and understand the question or the problem, the analytical problem that I'm dealing with. Of course, I keep on reminding myself that yes, because we have different labs here maybe represented, so the labs will have their strategies or whatever it is that they're working on, that they know that they're working within these specific areas. And coupling it with the sample preparation, some of the methods, because normally when we go around the continent, the challenge is that very few labs will have very sensitive methods, instrument rather. Very few labs will have LCMS. Very few labs will have LCMS-MS. So we have, and then yet in the trading, when we are trading, some of the information that is supposed to be extracted is supposed to be confirmed at that level of sensitivity. So when we look at the sample preparation methods from our research point of view, we are saying for us, for the continent, you might not be able to match, of course, the sensitivity of the LC-MS, but some of the methods that we are using for sample preparation enrich the analytes to a high level. So they are cleaning up and also enriching so that you can actually get better detection limits. So that if you have contaminants in your substance, you can still pick them at a certain level and then, of course, get confirmation for a laboratory that will have that type of equipment. Sorry, I didn't see the time that I started, so you will remind me. Please remind me at 10 minutes. Thanks. So, of course, I've already mentioned the method development. I'm not going to dwell on that because when you don't have a method, if a client brings you a problem and you don't have a method, you have to start from scratch. You have to develop that method, and in developing that method, you have to test and see if it is fit for purpose. You have to actually see if it's not doing what you want to do, you go back to the drawing board. So you actually have to look at the chart, the flow chart of the problem that you're actually trying to solve. And then normally, when we actually work in the method development, there is no way you can actually separate or leave out the validation because they go hand in hand. The method will have had optimum conditions, would have actually come up with the conditions for that method to perform to a certain level, but at the same time, we have to actually understand that now from here, where do we go? So can I identify an existing method? If not, then I have to go into the lab, which is where most of the research like labs will be doing, trying to find out new methods for analysis. Then and then actually I then talk about the method validation from just the lame or just where we actually trying to do the research institutions to say, you know, we work, for us the feeders are people maybe who are working in your labs or for people who actually come and work in a national lab. So normally we are actually trying to get them to understand the method development and the method validation and its importance, why it is necessary to do that. So we actually have the ISO definition, which has been modified in terms of why we actually have to do the method validation. Of course, because of the type of work that we do, we know that, as I said in the beginning, that everything is very critical. It is very important for us to actually work in a lab and understanding that what you are producing is reliable data, because it actually determines somebody's life or something. So we then look at it and see that it's a process that actually is defining an analytical requirement. So it actually should have a clear statement of what is required, what is the problem in the space, and then it confirms that the method under consideration has performance capabilities which are actually in line with the application that is required. So I cannot pull out a method that is not necessarily fitting for a specific or for a certain type of a matrix or for a certain type of application. I can not actually just pick a method and say I will use it. So I need to ensure that that method that I'm working with is in that space. So is it fit for purpose? That's the question that actually we're actually trying to address. And of course, we need to validate methods. when, because of the importance, as I have already alluded, of the measurements and analytical measurements, we know in the food industry, society generally, I mean, has all its interests being done by analytical chemists one way or the other, be it water, be it food, be it other types of products. In the courts, you know, in terms of forensic measurements, all this is actually coming from a space that you have to understand that the data that you have to actually present is credible. And then, of course, it's the professional duty for a chemist. So, when should methods be validated? Because at times people take methods and then they think it's been a method that is out there and the conditions, they've changed them, but they still think because they've changed parameter A, B, and C, they can still use it, it was validated. But now it's no longer designed the way it was when it was actually validated, so you have to actually consider that. So the first bullet is obviously what I've said, that we actually have a new method in the lab, definitely we validate. So our students, as we train them, they develop methods, they validate methods because it's a new method. So they have to look at all the performance criteria as to whether it's actually performing and test it on real samples and all that for it to be used elsewhere. So maybe we had a method that was established in the lab, but we have actually made some improvements. So we have changed some things in the method, and then it is no longer as it was outlined, you know, when actually we started using it. In that instance, we need to actually also validate. We need to actually go through the validation process. And maybe it is only applied, the method was only applied for a certain group of compounds or for certain matrix. Maybe it's a method for milk and we need to extend the application. And then in such a case, then you have changed the scope of the method. Hence now you have to consider validating it and looking going back to, is it still fit for purpose? Is it fit for this particular analytical problem or this matrix that we are actually working with? And then when we have validated method, as I will say just before I finish that, then you have a validated method in the lab. They are your QC checks. You always check for control. Are things in line? Are they working within what is supposed to be? So if they are actually your QC indicators actually show that something is changing in time, there is something that is actually going out of control in time within the method. Now that's the reason why you will say, you know what, let me look at this method again, let's go back and see what could have changed with time, and then we validate that method if we have actually made some alterations. And then of course an established method used in a different lab altogether. So normally we see methods that are published elsewhere, which is not in here. The continent has got different, some of the conditions are not the same as the conditions the way the method was tested. So we need, yes, the methods, we develop them and we want them to be rugged methods and robust methods. But at times, even in our labs, in the research labs, you find that the students find things have changed because of some, you know, conditions that have changed. So you need to actually understand that a method that has worked elsewhere, you cannot just come and start learning and testing. You need to start the method and verify and actually work on the validation as well of that particular method in your own lab. So there could be changes in the analyst as well, different instrumentation that has been actually purchased, and you actually want to do that. So the other thing is to demonstrate the equivalence between two methods, of course, which is what we actually like to do. We have a new method, we need to actually run in parallel with an established method or a standard method to see that indeed for this particular matrix, for the bovine muscle, for cereal, for whatever, it is actually performing in the same way as what we actually said it should. And so how should methods be validated rather, and who carries out the method validation? So that's why I was saying at the beginning, when we actually have a conversation, people saying, no, but I'm using already a validated method. So it was validated elsewhere. So I don't have to actually validate. From our school, is that when you have a method, and yes, it's been validated in America, yes, it's been validated in the US, yes, it's been validated elsewhere. But when I come in my environment, my lab has to actually go through that protocol first before we start using the method for our daily. So it's a new method that we need to actually look at, and we see that indeed in this space it is performing. So we're actually also deciding the degree of validation that is required. So we can actually say, okay, fine, for this we have to validate to this particular extent. We're actually looking at these parameters, and some of them might not be speaking to the type of work that we're doing, so it's an adjustment that we've made based on what we actually desire to do. So of course these are the parameters that everyone knows, but it doesn't mean that for your lab all of them are actually carried out, because people have different. If your matrix is not as complex, and maybe if you're not looking at the list that I showed earlier, where you have got contaminants, where you want to look at residues, where you want to actually get a very sensitive method, where your compound or your material, your analyte is present in higher amounts. So you might not go into the real time, because remember, validation is very expensive. It's not a cheap process. It's an expensive process where when you are looking at all these parameters, if we go, because I cannot go into the detail, yes, it's fundamentals, but I can't go to the statistics and then go and say, you know what, for us to say we're actually doing a calibration, we have to have the N and the M's, and you know, we have to have at least 10 points, and the replicants, which are actually, you know, so many 5 replicants or 10 beta 10 and 10, but you know, so, but that means there is a lot of investment that is done, because according to the book, if we were to do that, we'll have so many. If we have got 10 points in your calibration, it means each and every point is actually replicated, and hence there's a lot of work that is actually going in there, and the expense in terms of the time for the instrument, the time for your solvents if you are using chromatographic methods, and so forth. So there is things that you can actually then say for your method, what is it that you're actually taking out, and then the tools for that. I'm told it's time up, so I'll just quickly wrap up on this list to say the tools that we actually have. You've got all sorts of tools that we have. At times in our continent, people say we struggle to get the certified reference materials. People actually struggle to actually get those because they're expensive, of course. And then it gets worse when there's some specific types of material which is not readily available. So it is actually costly to do that type of a study. But we have all these tools or materials that we can actually use. You can use blanks, we can do recoveries, fortified materials, spiked, incurred materials, and so forth. So for instance, the incurred materials, you are looking at maybe the herbicides, which actually are looked in the flour when you transfer, which you are actually picking together with whatever was in your analyte. This is something that is there while it was actually even in the growing stage of your material, material and so forth. So I think I will actually pause here and say, this is a very big topic. For me, I didn't understand where I should slice and start and stop. But the quality, it means that once you've validated, you actually have to do quality, as I've said, the quality assurance. But before I stop, I just want to say, we have got vast information, literature that is out there, which for us, or for me to be specific, we have actually labs in Africa that have developed methods for maybe the labs here in Africa. But we are still stuck in terms of doing proficiency testing, because it means that to take that method that has been developed and get it tested elsewhere, do participation, participate in the proficiency testing, do collaborative, testing and all that. we have all the data out there, but nobody is actually saying, we see you've done this, can we test and see that this method does work? Because some of the methods, for instance, as I said, for me, they are actually greener. Some of them, they don't even consume a lot of solvents. We go through volumes and volumes of solvents with still the liquid extraction methods, yet we get even better data with greener methods. But because we are just publishing and people are publishing, the labs are running separately. So there is no integration between what the academia is doing and what the labs in the food industry are doing for us to solve things that we can. Why should we go through very toxic solvents, and why should we actually use so much volume of solvents if in microliters I can do the same work? And with that, I just would like to thank you for listening.
Let's applaud her once more, the South African way. The second presenter is Dr. Angelique Botha. She will be presenting on proficiency testing and the CRM. Angelique Botha is a chief metrologist at the National Metrology Institute of South Africa. She's the current chairperson of ISO-REMCO, the ISO Committee on Reference Materials, and the convener of Working Group 16 in ISO-REMCO, responsible for the revision of ISO Guide 35 of 2006. It's on reference materials, general and statistical principles for certification. She also serves on other national and international ISO committees, as well as several of the working groups of the Consultative Committee for Metrology in Chemistry and Biology of the International Committee for Weights and Measures, CIPM. Angelica, welcome to make your presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much, Jeffrey, for that kind introduction. So yes, I'm Angelique Botha. I'm with the National Metrology Institute working in our inorganic analysis laboratory, so something completely different from what Professor Dube is doing, but I want to thank her for her kind introduction to what is important when you're talking about testing, what are the fundamentals. And it's my privilege today to tell you a little bit more about the tools that she mentioned in her last slide, specifically the certified reference materials and the proficiency testing schemes that you can use to basically validate your methods and to test the comparability of your measurement results. So the case study I'm going to use is pesticides in South Africa. So pesticide usage is necessary to maintain both agricultural productivity as well as human health in South Africa. In South Africa, we have a wonderful climate, so it's very nice for us humans, but of course the pests and the hojas like it very much as well. So that is why we need to use so many pesticides. We also have a huge variety of crops that we grow in the country, so the range of pesticides that you will need to keep the pests under control, also a wide range. And then we need to eradicate these pesticides from our crops to preserve the food safety, and we also use the pesticides for vector control. So let's just look a little bit at our export market in terms of agricultural products to the EU on this slide specifically. So mostly fruit, fresh fruits and dried fruits, also citrus fruit, and then our wine and fermented products. Those are the major export products. So if we look at what's happening in terms of recalls and alerts, you can see in 2017 it was a little bit lower, but obviously there is a problem in terms of recalls and alerts on our food products when we are exporting. So let's just look a little bit more in detail at what's happening. So the biggest problem is with nuts and seeds, if we look at the commodities, and also fish and fruit. And in terms of the pesticides and the contaminants, the biggest problem seems to be mycotoxins, but also chemical contaminants and pesticides. So let's just see what we can do about it. So we would like to improve measurement results because accurate quantification of pesticides will of course reduce the number of alerts and the recalls of our products. We want to obtain measurement results that are equivalent internationally. So how do we ensure that our measurement results are equivalent compared to other laboratories in the rest of the world? The easiest way is if we can just send samples to every laboratory all over the world, the same sample, and then let them analyze, and let's just see how comparable our results are. Of course, this is not a very practical approach. It's very expensive to ship samples around all over the world. Most of these samples and the contaminants we want to analyze in these samples are not stable, so really not a practical solution. So what else can we do? Internationally, a system has been developed where we can basically use metrological traceability, or as it's more commonly known, measurement traceability. So where you can basically take your measurements and perform it in such a way that you can trace it back through links of measurements with uncertainty estimates back all the way to a reference. And typically the ideal reference that we want is an SI unit, or a reference to the system of SI units, because then everybody will get the same answer. So why would we like to use this approach? Because it ensures that measurement results are equivalent to those made in other countries that are tracing their measurement results back to the same SI units. The SI units are an internationally recognized system, and this will make it easier to export your products because now everybody will get the same result when they analyze your sample. So this definition, very importantly, is taken from the International Vocabulary for Metrology, not your ideal piece of bedtime reading, but, or actually it is perfect for bedtime reading, but yes, I would encourage you to familiarize yourself in the world of measurement with this vocabulary. So how do you make a traceable measurement? To establish traceability of a result, you would like the complete measurement procedure to be traceable, and typically the best way to do it is to use a primary method. So here's a very long definition of what a primary method is. It talks about the highest metrological quality. It talks about describing your measurement process, writing down your uncertainty budget. It talks about SI units again. But most importantly is it's a measurement that you want to make without the use of a standard of the analyte that you're trying to measure. So if we just show you very simply, so you have a method and you can perform your method without needing a standard, a reference material to get the right answer. Just a little bit more on primary methods. These methods are typically not so easy to perform routinely. Some of these methods include isotope dilution mass spectrometry, where you would need a very expensive mass spectrometer to be able to look at isotope ratios and how they change if you spike the samples. But we also have very traditional wet chemical measurement methods that you can use, tetrametry, colometry, gravimetry. But to understand these methods is a very time-consuming process, and our traditional wet chemists are basically a dying breed. Chemists that really understand what are the side reactions that can take place when you do your titration, how you can eliminate these side reactions taking place and any other interferences. So primary methods typically not very accessible to routine analytical laboratories. So what are the other methods that you can use to make your measurement results traceable? You can use an analytical procedure where you make measurements on a pure analyte, on the pure sample of your analyte. So this is typically your spiking studies where you would use standard addition to calibrate. So you'll have a very pure substance of your analyte and you'll perform spiking to get a calibration curve using standard addition. Then the other approach is using an analytical procedure where you make measurements on a certified reference material, a CRM, or you can also have the approach where the whole community of laboratories that want to perform this measurement will basically use exactly the same measurement method, and then all the measurement results will be traceable to that empirical method. So these are typically analysis of analytes such as dietary fibers, fat content, where if you use another method than the laboratory next door, you will get a completely different answer. So I would just like to talk a little bit more about using certified reference materials and how you can get a traceable measurement result using your CRM. So what is a certified reference material? This is a very complete, intense definition from ISO Guide 30. It is the guide on the definitions and concepts related to reference materials developed by ISO. I just want to highlight the important aspects of the definition. So it's a reference material. The two most important requirements for a reference material: it must be sufficiently stable and homogeneous for your purpose of measurement. Then if you're looking at a certified reference material, the additional characteristics include you need to certify or characterize your material using a metrologically valid procedure. You want a certified value for your material with an associated uncertainty and with a statement of metrological traceability. So again, the metrological traceability, the measurement traceability, very important. So how to use a CRM? I'm not going to go into the details, I just want to share some of the important concepts with you. So first, you have to make sure that you are actually using a certified reference material. So the first clue will be that you get your reference material from an accredited reference material producer. There is now a new wonderful international standard, ISO 17034, that was published in 2016, that basically outlines the requirements for a competent reference material producer, and you can now become accredited to the standard if you want to be a reference material producer. In the world nowadays, there's about 200 reference material producers accredited to this standard now, and it is growing. Unfortunately, in South Africa, there are only 2, but I hope that number will also grow in our own country. Then, another way to make sure that you are actually working with a certified reference material is to go and look at the certificate for this material and go and see if it meets all the requirements for the documentation that is required with certified reference material. And this you can find in ISO Guide 31, which is another guide developed by ISO that basically step-by-step outlines what the elements of a reference material is that you need to document, either in the certificate or in the product information sheet for your material. Then the next thing, you need to match your CRM as closely as possible to your routine samples. So what are the things that you need to consider? First of all, the matrix. How close is the matrix of your CRM to the matrix of your routine samples? Then the level of the analyte that you want to analyze. Is the level of the analyte in your CRM higher or is it lower? You would really like to get it as close as possible, especially if you're working close to detection limits for your method. Then you also need to consider, when I do the sample preparation for my routine samples, how comparable is it to the sample preparation that I'll perform on my certified reference material? Because if there are maybe additional steps that you need to take to prepare your routine sample compared to your certified reference material, this can have an effect on the comparability of the measurement results. Then you need to perform repeated measurements on your CRM to just see how repeatable your method is. You need to get a standard uncertainty, and for this you need the certificate of your CRM again. So your uncertainty must be reported on your certificate for your certified reference material. ISO Guide 31 again explains very nicely how the uncertainty must be reported so that you can convert that uncertainty to a standard uncertainty. Then you determine if you have a bias with your measurement results, and then there are different ways to treat your bias. You can correct for your bias, or you can decide not to correct for your bias, and then you'll need to include the bias in your uncertainty estimate, or you can report your bias separately. So there's lots of guidance on how you can do that. I've highlighted here that very nice application note that you can download from the internet, ERM application note number 3, that explains to you how you can use your certified reference material, especially for trueness testing, so to check for bias. Then ISO Guide 33 basically focus on the use of reference materials. So it explains to you what the requirements of your reference material will be to be able to use it for different purposes, ranging from method validation, method development, how to do repeatability, reproducibility studies, how to set up your quality control charts, anything that you will use your reference material for, how to do it, what to do, what the requirements for the material is, you'll find in that guide. And then there's a very nice Eurochem guide on method validation that explains to you also how you use the reference materials for each of that very nice list that Prof. Dube showed of the method validation parameters that you need to consider and evaluate. How to do it, what is important, when do you need to do everything, when you only need to do a few things when you're doing method validation. So this Eurochem guide is available for download for free from the Eurochem website, eurochem.org. Okay, so now you have a validated method, and now you want to continue to assure the quality of your measurement results. So here are a few of the tools mentioned in the new ISO 17025 standard of 2017 for the competence of testing and calibration laboratories that you can use. So I've already talked about certified reference materials and quality control materials. Next, I want to talk a little bit about proficiency testing. So the important requirements for proficiency testing. First of all, preferably you would want a reference value that is metrologically traceable. So again, coming back to metrological traceability. If you can't get a reference value for your proficiency testing scheme, you would really like to have a good consensus value amongst the participants. So that will be affected by the number of participants, and ideally you would also want participants that have validated their methods properly using reference materials to make sure that the results that they report are also metrologically traceable. Then another tool that you can use is replicate testing. Professor Dube also spoke about that. So let's talk a little bit more about proficiency testing, and I want to specifically talk about our own proficiency testing schemes for pesticides in fruit. So the NMISA is committed to supporting laboratories through the provision of proficiency testing schemes that afford participating laboratories the opportunity to regularly demonstrate their continued analytical measurement competence. So we provide a confidential service to the participants that allows you to assess your own routine results, how accurate they are, and you can also use this tool to improve, and you can also use it as a quality assurance tool because it gives you an external point of reference to tell you how you're doing in terms of the accuracy of your measurement results. You're comparing yourself with other laboratories. So the report is generated, and it wants to help the laboratories to identify issues in their measurement processes and to improve. So the current protocol for the study has been designed to support routine analytical laboratories testing pesticide residues in agricultural commodities. So as it's also considers seasonal changes, so what pesticides are used in different seasons on different products, and it also tries to look at the very nice triangle of food commodities, the AOAC triangle, to try and cover all the different kinds of food commodities. So the scheme tries to look at the maximum residue levels that has been specified for the South African market. And I already mentioned it matches seasons as well, what pesticides are used when. And then that's basically just looking at mentioning the same things again. So I just want to talk a little bit about how it's done. We just use the normal Z-score approach where the results from the laboratory is compared with an average or the consensus value for the study and the spread of the study, and then you have a Z-score basically to say, are you doing good, do you need to improve. So very similar to the approach used in ISO 17043, the standard for proficiency testing providers that was published in 2010. So just a little bit about the results that we've received so far. There you can see the issues that have been identified is chlorpyrifos in soft fruits and also in citrus fruits. So that's where the major effort is being put into improving the results and assisting laboratories in getting better results on these measurements. So that's basically it. In closing, I just want to remark that Professor Dube also talked about the availability of certified reference materials, specifically matrix reference materials. It's very difficult. Therefore, I'm very proud to say that the NMISA is in the process of establishing a facility for matrix reference material production. You're most welcome to go and have a look at our website just to keep your eyes on what's happening and when things will be happening in terms of the materials that we are developing. There's going to be a material on wheat flour focusing on heavy metals. There's a material being developed for mycotoxins in white maize and a whole range of other materials focusing specifically on African commodities. Because if you go and look at Wikipedia, you can go and have a look at Wikipedia, there's a whole list of links of internationally accredited reference material producers, but it will be difficult to find real African commodities amongst their materials. There's also a COMAR database, comar.de, where you can go and search for any kind of reference material that you are interested in. So yes, the NMISA is very dedicated to provide matrix reference materials to you that is of Africa for use in the development and validation of your own methods. Then also the proficiency testing schemes. It's not only the NMISA that's providing proficiency testing, the National Laboratory Association also has schemes. There is FAPAS that are providing schemes for food analysis. And then there's a whole database called Additives with a whole large list of accredited proficiency testing providers. So you're most welcome to also go and have a look there if you can find somebody that can provide the service that you need. So you need to go and look for a PT that will work for you, and you need to use this tool to improve, to get better, and to also develop more methods in your laboratory. So the key is continued improvement. It's a tool to identify challenges in your measurement process before there are issues, before our country gets recalls on the products that you want to export. Again, very important for the NMISA and for most or for all proficiency testing providers is the confidence of the client. Not only in the confidentiality, but trusting that you will get a good scheme with a good value where you can improve and where you can identify issues. And it's also a tool for the mutual recognition of results. Remember that big comparison study with the hundreds of results to really get comparability on an international scale. So that's basically it from my side. I thank you for your attention. If you have any questions about the guidance that is available, or where you can find a proficiency testing scheme, or if you have a question about a reference material that you're looking for, or something that you're struggling with in your method validation or method development, there's my email. Please, you're most welcome to contact me. Thank you very much.
Let's applaud once more. Okay. The third presenter is Dr. Joe Poisson. He will be presenting on chemical methods implementation, verification, and validation. Dr. Poisson recently returned from the Canadian Food Inspection Agency after that 1 year of public service. He holds 2 adjunct professor faculty positions in the College of Graduate Studies at the University of Should we have phone? Okay. He was appointed a fellow World Innovation Foundation in 2003, was awarded the CFI President's National Award for Leadership Excellence in 2010, and was appointed a fellow of the AOAC International in 2012. He was the recipient of the 2015 AOAC International Harvey Wheeler Award and was appointed as senior member of the Joint FAO WHO Expert Committee on Food Additives, JEFCA, in 2017. His research and academic interests during his tenure in the public service included development of chromatographic and mass spectrometric methods for the detection, identification, and confirmation of veterinary drug residues in biological fluids and tissues in support of regulatory enforcement and of pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamics studies. Join me in welcoming Professor to make his presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to try and take you through a course this morning that looks at why we have to do laboratory analysis, all right, for chemical residues. Going to start off by looking at the creation of the joint WHO-FAO Expert Committee on Food Additives, the creation of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, the creation of the subcommittee of the Codex Alimentarius Committee called the Codex Committee on Residues of Veterinary Drugs in Foods, and why laboratories must use validated analytical methods. And once I've gone through that, I'd like then to look at what is really the difference between method validation and method verification. And time permitting, I'll look at what we call single laboratory validation and multi-laboratory validation, and perhaps touch on the AOAC version of this called the method standard performance requirements. So, the evaluation of the food additives at the international level was initiated as a result of a joint FAO-WHO conference on food additives and nutrition held in Geneva in Switzerland in 1955. At that conference, it was recommended to the Directors Generals of the United Nations FAO and WHO that one or more expert committees should be convened to address the technical and administrative aspects of chemical additives and their safety in food. So on the basis of that recommendation, JECFA, that's the Joint Expert Committee on Food Additives, were created in 1955, and it held its first meeting in that same September of that same year. JECFA was formed to serve as an independent scientific committee which performs risk assessments and provides advice to the FAO, WHO, and member countries of both organizations. Now, remember that at that time in space, risk assessment, risk management were the buzzwords, and so if JECFA had been established, created to serve as a risk assessor, there ought to be a risk manager to manage the assessments that have been done. So following recommendations from JECFA and requests from other Codex committees, food additives was defined by the conference as non-nutritive substances added internationally to food, generally in small quantities, to improve appearance, flavor, texture, or storage properties. The definition was broadened to include substances like veterinary drug residues, components of packaging materials, solvents used in food processing, and so on, including metals in foods and naturally occurring toxicants. I'm going to pretty much limit my presentation to vet drug residues because that's the area that I've been attached the most. So at the first meeting of JECFA, it was established that principles for the use of food additives and made JECFA established principles for the use of food additives and made recommendations on methods to establish their safety. So JECFA is already beginning to define what methods need to be used in defining food safety. And the committee also recognized that no single pattern of tests could cover adequately the testing of substances so diverse in structure and function as food additives. Now, at the second meeting, it was also concluded by JECFA that it was only possible to formulate general recommendations with regard to testing procedures. So for veterinary drugs in foods, the terms of reference of JECFA was established to elaborate principles for evaluating their safety and for quantifying the risk, establish acceptable daily intake and other guidance values to enable them to calculate acute exposure, and recently to establish acute exposure, and then recommend maximum residue limits for target tissues. So we recognize right away that the establishment and definition of maximum residue limits for vet drugs was given under the jurisdiction of JECFA. And JECFA would determine appropriate criteria for evaluating methods of analysis for detecting and or quantifying residues in foods. So JECFA, recognizing its role as a risk assessor, they needed to be a risk manager. And so this resulted in the creation of the Codex Alimentarius Commission in 1963. So the Codex Alimentarius Commission was created in 1963 by the FAO and WHO to develop food standards, guidelines, and related texts such as codes of practice under the joint WHO-FAO standards to protect human health, to ensure that trade practices in food trade, fair trade practices in food trade, and promote coordination of all food standards work undertaken by the international government and non-governmental organizations. Now, while this was going on, there was a growing concern about mass medication of food-producing animals and the implications for human health and international trade. So in November 1984, a joint FAO-WHO expert consultation was held in Rome to consider various issues relating to the presence of food chemicals used in animal husbandry and veterinary medicine. So the consultation ended up with recommendation to create or establish the Codex Committee on Residues of Veterinary Drugs in Foods. So in 1984, CCR-VDF was created to serve as the risk manager together with the Codex Alimentarius Commission in managing the risk assessments that have been done by JECFA. So the CCR-VDF determines priorities for the consideration of residues of veterinary drugs in foods and recommends maximum residue limits for veterinary drugs. So JECFA defines the MRLs, and CCR-VDF through the CAC determines whether to enforce these or to make changes. So CCR-VDF also develops codes of practice as may be required and considers methods of sampling analysis for the determination of veterinary drugs in foods. CCR-VDF is hosted by the United States of America, and it provides, together under the auspices of the Codex Alimentarius Commission, provides advice on risk management issues related to residues of veterinary drugs in foods. So the CCR-VDF will either recommend the MRLs proposed by JECFA or modifies them in consideration of other legitimate factors, or ask JECFA to reconsider the MRLs that have been proposed. It was also recommended by the Directors General of FAO and WHO to convene an appropriate scientific body to advise member governments and CCR-VDF on questions pertaining to residues on veterinary drugs in foods of animal origin in terms of both public health, potential public health hazards, and barriers to international trade. So at the first session of the CCR-VDF that was held in Washington, D.C. in 1986, they made several recommendations for consideration by JECFA. And one of the considerations that were made was that the CCR-VDF that JECFA would have the primary responsibility for reviewing methods for compounds, and because JECFA was going to have that primary responsibility, they published a document entitled JECFA Requirements for Validation of Analytical Methods, which JECFA uses till now to evaluate methods under the veterinary drug residue program. So if JECFA is requiring and developing criteria for methods, obviously there must be a need for drug residue methods. And not just methods, but sensitive and suitable methods. So what is happening is that suitable analytical methods are therefore necessary to adequately define the nature, including isomeric composition and chemical purity of the materials involved, investigated during in vitro and in vivo hazard identification and characterization studies, and the speciation of the veterinary drug. These methods are also required for the determination of concentrations where incurred residues are concerned, as well as for the identification and quantification of the substances for which MRLs are recommended by JECFA. And all of this is required because the expert committee, JECFA, must be assured that any veterinary drug that it evaluates is well characterized with details of the chemical and physical properties of the drug and the concentrations and identity of any impurities. Now, as with any other discipline, the definitions of terms that we need to become acquainted with, and I'm just going to pull out 4 of them that reverberate through all Codex and ISO documents related to veterinary drugs. A veterinary drug, a marker residue, a target tissue, and an MRL. If you find a drug, there is no MRL defined by Codex, that product is probably not approved for use in veterinary food animal production. So we're going to see that all these 4 terms reverberate through all the documentation that deal with veterinary drug residues. And because the whole idea of what JECFA and Codex are doing is to facilitate trade, it is important that the marker residue, which is what the labs are going to identify and determine, provide unequivocal evidence of exposure to the drug. The target tissue usually selected is the one where the edible tissue in which residues or the macro residues occur at the highest concentrations and are most persistent. For lipophilic substances, the usual target tissue is fat. That's why we include fat in the analysis, laboratory sample analysis. But for most other substances, depending on the primary route of elimination, the target tissue is liver or kidney. So we will typically, the 4 tissue matrices that we will typically analyze will be fat, liver, kidney, and muscle tissue. And one of these tissues is usually a target tissue designated for use in testing domestically produced foods of animal origin. For export, however, for import, because the organ tissues may not be available, muscle tissues are generally the ones that are targeted for testing. So we've talked about JEGFA as a risk assessor. We've talked about the Codex Alimentarius Committee and the CCR VDF as the risk managers. And we've also defined a few terms that reverberate through the analytical vet drug residue profile. Why do we need analytical methods? What are the criteria for analytical methods that JEGFA will consider suitable? So, the Codex Alimentarius Committee, because of its role as a risk manager, has defined guidelines for testing laboratories. So I've got a couple of slides ahead of me. So the analytical methods that Codex would like to see will have to have these performance parameters: selectivity, limit of detection, limit of quantitation, accuracy and precision, and some measure of descriptive behavior of the calibration curves. If you typically look at a lot of what is done in most academic institutions, they comply with all of these. But okay, so the methods recommended for monitoring at the university levels usually sit at the previous slide. They do not typically include applicability, practicability, and ruggedness. And because these are, JEGFA also requires the testing laboratories to have these qualifications. To ensure the role of testing laboratories are harmonized, they have to comply with the general criteria, they have to use internal quality control procedures, and they have to participate in appropriate proficiency testing schemes. Wherever available, they have to use validated methods. Okay, so in addition to all that I've said, the CCI VDF also has published guidelines for the approaches to be used in validating methods. And it is in a document called CAC/GL 71/2009. Okay, so the whole principle of method validation is designed to demonstrate that the method is fit for purpose. That means that in the hands of a properly trained and experienced analyst, using the specified equipment and materials and following the standard operating procedure, they have to be able to replicate the method. The validation. So here we look at methods validated in a single laboratory or in a multi-laboratory scheme. When a method is developed in a multi-laboratory scheme and someone can pull it off and check the SOP in their laboratory and are able to replicate it, that process is called verification. All right? When you don't have a method or one that has been validated only in a single laboratory and hasn't gone through the multi-residue laboratory, it has to undergo validation. All right? And so, just for lack of time, a method that is developed in a single laboratory has to be validated according to AOAC guidelines. It has to be under ISO 17025, and it should be complemented with information on accuracy demonstrated, for instance, by regular participation. And the results must be verified with other validated methods where these are available. Okay, so I will just conclude by saying that the validation, okay, so in conclusion, the reason why we need to analyze anything in any of our laboratories is because, first of all, it is demanded by Codex, Alimentarius, Commission, JECFA, and CCR-BDF, and the methods have to be ones that have been validated according to ISO 17025, and they have to, the labs must continuously demonstrate proficiency by participating in proficiency study programs. Thank you.
Let's applaud him once more. Before I introduce the next speaker, I want to do something extraordinary. Where is Dr. Victoria? Where are you? She's not around. Okay. Dr. Victoria is celebrating her birthday today. I want us sing happy birthday for her. Who is going to read that? Owen? Happy birthday.
Okay, all of us together.
Okay, let's go.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
The next presenter is Dr. Erin Crowley, Medication, Verification, Process Validation. Dr. Erin is the Chief Scientific Officer at Q Laboratory in Cincinnati, Ohio. Prior to this, she was the Microbiology Research and Development Supervisor at Q Laboratories, Ohio since 2006. For the past 12 years, Erin and the Research and Development team have served as an independent third-party laboratory with a primary focus on providing high-quality method validation for microbiological rapid detection methods. These validations include independent laboratory evaluations for pathogen detection, qualitative methods, and confirmatory biochemical assays for AOAC official methods of analysis, AOAC Research Institute's Performance Testing Methods Program, Microbiological, and AFNO-NF certification programs. In addition to being an active member of the International Association of Food Protection and AOAC, Erin currently serves as chair of the AOAC Official Methods Board, chair of the International Stakeholder Panel on Alternative Methods, and a member of the Microbiological Technical Committee. Erin earned a BSc from the University of Cincinnati in Ohio and an MA from Tufts University in Medford. Join me in welcoming Dr. Erin to make her presentation.
morning, everyone. It's hard to follow a birthday celebration with talking about method validation and verification, but I'm going to try to keep it as exciting as possible. I don't know about all of you, but when you try to explain to your family and friends what you do for a living, and you say you are in method validation and verification, they usually just want to move on to another discussion, another topic. So despite where we are around the globe, I'm happy to be amongst the friends, as we say, who do speak this language. So moving forward, I want to just switch gears to talking about the microbiological perspective of validation and verification. And even though there are many overlaps from what we've heard previously in our discussions this morning, there are a few specific differences of how we define reference materials, the study design that we frequently use, but most importantly, looking at it from the perspective of most of the methods that I'm going to be referencing or talking about today are diagnostic test kits that have been created for proprietary use by a variety of companies who are also represented here today. So this is the perspective that I'm going to provide. So while we use validation and verification interchangeably, we have seen that there are some significant differences in how they're actually applied. So we're going to talk about that very briefly and my perspective on the definition of those. An example on the study design, specifically on verification, we've heard yesterday when past President Benesh provided us with an overview of the validation guidance and the validation design. I'm going to focus a little bit more on the verification side and how we're implementing those methods. The guidance document specifically on verification and how it's being interpreted, and implementation, and then also the case study of a few of the examples that we have just at Q Laboratories on verification of methods in our own commercial labs. So I always tell my team at Q Labs and when I'm speaking with the AOAC community, let's not reinvent the wheel, if you will. Let's not add or create new definitions for those that exist. So I prefer to stick to the definitions that are presented in ISO 6140 Part 1 for validation and verification. And although they are a bit verbose, this is really what we call the official definition. For validation is establishing the performance characteristics of the method and providing the evidence that the performance characteristics for an intended use are fulfilled. How that differs with verification is that you're demonstrating that the validated method functions in the user's hands according to the method specification. What is in the package insert needs to be verified within your lab. Another way of putting it is validation is the method performing correctly? And verification is, are you performing the correct method? So we saw an overview of this yesterday, but I always like to provide this for reference in the validation guidelines. AOAC has their own set of validation guidelines, as well as ISO, the 16140 series, as we heard in the overview yesterday. We have validation guidelines, and in the micro community, you may be familiar with this, Appendix J, something we live with every day and know quite well. But these are the guidelines for quantitative and qualitative method validation that the diagnostic test kit companies use. And also, it could serve as a model for those laboratories that are wanting to do validation in-house to perform their own validation scheme according to the design that's in that method. Another addition to the Appendix J is actually confirmatory and identification methods as well. And then, although it alludes to the need for a collaborative study if you're going to get an official method, Appendix D within the official methods of analysis actually provides guidance on how to construct and execute a collaborative study. And as we heard yesterday, the 16140 series has a few of the standards that are used within the ISO certification realm, specifically Part 1 and 2. 1 deals with the terminology. 2 is the validation design for quantitative and qualitative methods. Part 6, as we heard yesterday, is specifically dealing with identification and confirmation methods. And it really is a bit of an amplified example of what is presented in Appendix J, and an opportunity that we've been able to demonstrate where harmonization is possible between all of the certification bodies. The reason why I bring this up is when we're talking about the context of validation and verification, we want to be clear that, as we see here, Microval, NMKL, NF Validation, AOAC, these are certification bodies. So these are certifying the method and the claim that that method has. This is not accreditation. The method is implemented into your quality standards and the accreditation system that you have within your laboratory. So just an overview, we, as microbiologists, spend a lot of time referring to Annex A, as the abbreviation is called. And we, not only as labs, but also as consultants and as method developers, reference Annex A quite frequently, and that is part of the ISO 16140 Part 2. And what it does is it provides us with guidance. Frequently, because I've been in method validation for a while, I get calls that say, what should I include in my claim? Should I do meat? Should I do produce? Should I do spices? I was reading the other day that peanut butter is a problem, or I was reading the other day that lettuce is a problem. And while I say, I would love to provide guidance, I don't want you to come back and say, Erin, why did you guide me on this particular claim when, you know, I'm not selling any test kits? So we say, go to Annex A. Now, as Deanne Benesh alluded to yesterday, it isn't comprehensive, which is why we're here. How can we look at the commodities specifically within the African countries and include them into these categories? While they are broad in scope and they could be really defined in a lot of different ways, it isn't comprehensive. Why does this matter? When we look at the categories and the types of foods within those categories, they're directly related to the validation claim that is made. So when you see in the certificate of validation and you look in the official methods of analysis, that applicability statement has a lot of meaning behind it. We're referring to Annex A on the what, and then the AOAC validation scheme as well as ISO is how many. So about 6 or 7 years ago, we made the decision within AOAC and then subsequently within the ISO community to really define the rate or the claim and specify it by the number of foods. There used to be, you may have seen some of the old official methods, an all foods claim. It's impossible to really make that claim, and it's very misleading, as you may know. So the broad range of foods that we see here includes 15 different foods amongst a minimum of 5 categories. That also includes environmental samples, and it is quite commonly included in the validation scheme within AOAC, although with ISO that is in addition to 5 food categories. A variety foods is 5 categories, but 2 types per category. Select foods is 2 categories, and usually 5 different foods, but across different categories. So infant formula and milk powder, or poultry and minced meat, if you're going into the meat category. There's a little bit of flexibility there. Select categories is really looking at something specific. You see a lot of methods that are just validated for infant formula, or only validated for produce, or only validated for environmental samples on stainless steel. And I bring this up because it really does drive the decision and the scope of your verification. So we use this guidance. It is not the only guidance, but it is the closest thing that we have to formal guidance as of now, which is the draft version of the ISO standard, Part 3 of the 16140 series, where we're really looking at how we want to do verification. And as we heard earlier, validation is expensive, but so is verification. When you're trying to make that decision, In my organization, I'm the one that makes the decision on what method we're going to use, how it's going to be used, what is the best option for our laboratories that we have. And within the scope, even though I'm the technical oversight, I have responsibility to respond to the chief financial officer who wants to make sure that we're conducting verification in a smart yet financially responsible way. So this is a bit hard to see, but will be available in the decks after the meeting. But we're really looking at multiple layers here. In the validation, we're looking at the scope of the method. What are the different products that are going to be included, or the categories and types that are going to be included? The scope of the validation. How many of those are we going to include in the formal validation for the AOAC PTM or OMA program or ISO 16140? How many of those do we really want to include in the entire scope of the validation? And then the scope of the lab applications. You're the decision maker in your organization. You're pulling off that validation certificate from the AOAC website or the ISO certification body websites, and you're looking at all of those foods and seeing how closely related they are to what you use in your lab and what you test in your lab. So that's really where we're talking about the verification implementation here. How's it going to work in your lab? So 6140 Part 3, as I said, provides an example, and I will be completely transparent in saying that we do a variety of designs within our lab, and a lot of it depends on what the client wants, and a lot of it depends on the volume of testing for a particular product. So Part 3 in the draft actually has two separate components of verification. One is the implementation verification, and the second part is the food verification. So the implementation is taking the method as it is published, official method or ISO method, as it is published, taking that protocol exactly the way it is, and validating at least, or verifying, one food that was included in the claim. So if you have poultry and chicken carcass rinse, for example, something we test quite frequently in the States, you would take that product and verify it according to the method as it's written. No modifications, exactly as it's written and published and has been approved. In the food item verification there, however, is looking at how this is going to work in your laboratory. There may be enrichment modifications, there may be specific food products. As in the US, we have a lot of composite testing that we use within the micro community, where we use 375 gram sample sizes. So we have to look very responsibly at the products that we use, and is it going to work according to the method as it's published, or do we really need to look at something different? And I apologize for the typo, vaulted. I don't know what a vaulted method is, but vetted is the intention there. So this is really where we get into the specifics. What does that mean? This is from the ISO 16140 Part 3 draft as an overall summary. And this is really looking at the reference method that has been used and the alternative method and the comparison between the two. And performing a comparison of the reference method versus the alternative method within your lab is really based on the validation data that's available. Is it published? Is it limited in scope? Is there no publication data? It's really how you have to design your own verification. But it's the summary down here that is critical. So we have the implementation verification. It's looking at one food, one replicate minimum for the implementation. One of those foods that was in the official validation, running that in your lab. The food item verification is question I get often, how many samples, how many replicates? We say a minimum of 5. If there's readily available publication for a method, using at least 5 replicates for that food type within your lab that's a specific commodity that you frequently test. So this is just more of a deep dive into, say, a broad range of foods. You have 5 categories, 3 types within that category at a minimum. with published validation data. Not only is it could be a certificate, or it could be a publication within the journal AOAC or another professional journal, but must have been officially validated through a certification body. So you have these 5 categories, you have the types, you have the items, which is really individual types of products within that, individual products within that type. Using one food that was in the validation and running at least one replicate, minimum. Then the food item verification is taking additional categories that you may be testing and you using a minimum of 5 replicates, 5 different types, preferably, of those matrices that are particularly challenging in your lab. In our lab, we test, our number 1 commodity that we test in our microbiology lab are spices and spice blends, and they have a lot of flavorings for snack foods or ready-to-eat products. Very often, we never see those in a validation study. We see black pepper, that is commonly used, and as one who does validation, I know that salmonella survives in black pepper much more than it does in clove or cinnamon or some of the other blends that we use. So this is where verification is really critical. So you have a limited range, perhaps 1 to 5 different food types, perhaps 1, 2, or 3 different categories. And the design is the same, however. Looking at one food in the validation, you're replicating that in your lab for the implementation component. And then the food verification, taking a minimum of 5 replicates of at least one food category, preferably more, that you would be using specifically in your lab. Same with the broad range with no published data. Obviously you cannot, this is where we do this is where we get a little more comprehensive in our lab. If there's no published data, then you obviously cannot do the implementation component as is specified in part 3, but you're really focusing on the food verification. And this is often where we will replicate the validation guidance. We're doing a minimum of 20 replicates instead of 5. So I had this question yesterday, I thought it was worth putting in here. And the qualitative design, how do you know what you're putting into the product? You know, the chemists often look at the microbiologists and say, you're just not exact. Well, we know when we say it's approximately 5 to 10, it's approximately 50 to 100, and while we're not trying to be to be less exact, we know that inoculation of products in microbiology is really part art, part science. Inoculation is the perfect example of that. So what we do within our lab is we have logarithmic growth curves of the specific organisms that we use. We know there's a log phase of the organism and a death phase of the organism, where we try to capture data over years and years and years of using Salmonella and using Listeria and using different strains of STEP and O157. What the performance of that organism looks like over time, over repeated isolates, traceable organisms, wild-type organisms. This is an example of how that is used. We know that we will have a particular serotype of Salmonella, and we have a target within validation of, say, 0.5 to 5, or 0.2 to 2 is a good example. 0.2 to 2 CFU per test portion. We're kind of targeting the middle range of that. When we're looking at verification, we'll often spike a little bit higher, and we'll do a series of dilutions. So at the end we have what we call a high level, an intermediate or high, medium low, and low to cover that limit of detection or the scope of the claim of that method. And we know within particular food products that varies. So we'll do a series of dilution, whereas here we have a target of 60 CFU per mil, and going all the way down to a target of about 2 per mil gives us an idea of what is in that product. Now in a validation guideline, or validation study, you have to do what's called a most probable number evaluation, but it can be quite expensive and isn't necessary for verification. just going to pass it here. We're looking at the acceptance criteria for qualitative method. Are you meeting the limit of detection of the method, the LOD? If the LOD of the method is 1 CFU, are you replicating that in your laboratory? So a lot of times I get this question, what does the LOD mean? Well, the LOD is 1, that's pre-enrichment. Most molecular methods are an LOD of 10 to the 3rd post-enrichment. So it's really how you're looking at it, and if anyone has specific questions about that, we're happy to go into that in more detail. Within the quantitative validation design, we're looking at the mean and the standard deviation of that data, which is a bit different from qualitative. So in the quantitative design, we're looking at 2 replicates, suspension A and B as an example. Often recommend using 2 analysts doing one replicate side by side with each other and comparing the results. Oftentimes, we also want to look at a variety of media options: prepared media, proprietary media compared to multiple lab supplier of a general media, dehydrated, with and without additives, antibiotic supplements, because many methods offer a variety of options. Okay, I'm almost done. So let me go through this because I'd rather talk about the implementation. So we're talking about the implementation. We've all had this. We have an excitement about new technology, but oftentimes we have the need for training and a reluctance to change. We have a financial impact. With the cultural methods, we always say that's X number of dollars. Immunoassay methods is about 2x number of dollars, and molecular methods are the premiums, about 4 times the cost of a regular cultural method. But it offers other benefits. Looking at location of equipment, the separation between sample prep and amplification, which may be necessary, and the actual construction of the physical space. What does the client need? Are they fine with PTM? Are they fine with OMA? Do they need it to be compared to an ISO reference method? And how many different products are we looking at? We have a client that has 700 different products. We're not going to verify all of those. But when we're talking about the applicability of the method, that's very critical. So in the interest of time, I'll go through this quickly. But we have a couple of examples of implementation within QLabs. The first of which is a quantitative method where we had a client that was doing a yeast and mold test on their low moisture products. And they were complaining about the 5-day turnaround time, which is specified in the cultural methods, both FDA and also ISO. So they wanted to go to an automated method that would reduce the turnaround time by 2 days. It would be a bit of an increase in cost. And they were slightly hesitant to change because the result actually was a combined yeast and mold result. However, the fact that they needed an AOAC official method for most of their products made it a bit difficult because there aren't any official methods that have a 3-day turnaround time until about 1.5 years ago with the Petri film methods and some of the tempo methods within some of the test kit companies that we work with. So what we did is we looked at these products, low moisture products, chocolate products, different sample sizes, and a cocktail of traceable organisms containing mold and yeast within the sample to challenge it at a variety of levels. Here we used a minimum of 5 replicates, and that was for the client, approving the protocols that it was fine for them, but they just had to make sure it was compared to the reference method, in this case the FDA method, for the purposes of the verification. And then the qualitative design, similar discussions, but in this case, the client needed a 1-day turnaround time, and they wanted a molecular method. However, for low moisture spices and spice blends, again, we never see these on validation certificates, and the ability to recover salmonella and listeria from a desiccated, stressed product is very complicated. And when we were talking with the technology companies, they said, yes, we have solutions for you, but it often involves 5 to 10 different enrichment schemes. So when you have a lab full of microbiologists and 500 to 700 different commodities within your lab, the last thing you want to do is have this wide variety of enrichment schemes, but we had to figure this out. So in this particular case, the client was compelled to do a full-scale validation on their products. They have a chocolate paste, which was one of their products, and then they also had several chocolate powders of varying colors and consistencies and pH. So we had to really challenge it with the Salmonella species, this was for Salmonella in particular, against this molecular method, but we wanted to get down into the serotypes that they have been seeing in their products or within the industry, because up until several years ago we didn't really think that Salmonella could survive in chocolate powder, but yet we know that that's true. But from a financial standpoint, the client, and we agreed with the client, to reach out to the test kit company and say, we have these specific products, we're going to be doing this testing frequently, and we want to partner with you on not only publishing the data, but helping to provide us with the kits to offset some of the expense. They have the availability to publish with us. The client is happy because they have their products validated, and they have a comprehensive study design that is following the international guidelines for validation. And then they were able to switch to a one-day method, which obviously was important. So in conclusion, we're talking about these different study designs for validation and verification, and expense does come up. So a couple of the things that I always recommend, and I believe it was in the previous presentation, but I'd like to also reiterate that, you can conduct your own verifications within your laboratory and demonstrate proficiency simultaneously by being involved in different proficiency testing programs. We know that some of the proficiency testing programs are quite an expense. So one way in which that is allowed, even through ISO accredited organizations, is participating in collaborative studies. You have access to that data following the completion of the study. You can run multiple sets of samples in many cases, and you can figure out how the level of the proficiency and the performance of the method both simultaneously within your lab in a way that is a lot more cost effective. So I did go a bit over my time, but I apologize. But thank you for your attention, and this concludes my presentation.
Once more. Thank you. The next presenter is Dr. Philip Tondo. We'll be talking about common issues with the sampling and the sampling plans. Dr. Philip started his career as a public health inspector in Liverpool, UK, specializing in the food industry, before moving on to join Lunch Meeting and FMCG Group in UK to work as a QC manager, second Miller and Group QA manager before joining the Research Center as a project coordinator. In 1985, he moved to South Africa to join the Wheat Board, where he handled grain and development, and there he established an ISO 17025. Then it used to be called ISO 925 laboratory. At the closure of the board in 1997, Philip established his own consultancy firm called PQT, Proper Planning and Preparation, and works globally on food fortification of staple food vehicles, establishing regulatory mechanisms, laboratory competency, industrial implementation, and internal-external monitoring protocols. Currently, he sits on several national and global technical advisory groups relating to fortification. Join me in welcoming Dr. Philip.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. One of the things I do when I come to meetings is I play workshop bingo. What you do is you write down 10 words, okay, and then you listen to other presenters and then the first one to come up with all 10 words on your list, you stand up metaphorically and shout bingo. There's a reason for this, and that's because there were a lot of key words that have been used. I'm going to go back to day one. Defensibility, risk analysis, authenticity, impossible. I like that one today. I hadn't thought about that one. I just added it to my list. And enforcement. Now, there's a reason why these words become important, because I deal with a very difficult matrix. First of all, let's go back to Codex. Codex is there saying that, your estimate is going to be, may be dependent on your method of analysis, but it's always going to be dependent on your sampling protocol. One of the things which we've been dealing with so far in the meeting has been what's going to go on in the lab. Because I deal with internal and external monitoring, and because very often I also get dragged into the regulatory component of it, the enforceability, I actually want us to look at what you're actually sending in, or what is actually coming into the laboratory. In the laboratory, you always have this nice little disclaimer. This analysis relates to this sample as provided. Okay? Lovely disclaimer, that gets you out of all sorts of trouble. Except the poor guy whose name is on the packet. Okay? He's the one who's now potentially going to go to court. If they're dealing with me, I haven't lost a court case yet on sampling. There's all this, it's a part of an official method, it's used there for your quantitative testing. But here's the bit with statistical probability, reliability, and safe to at a particular confidence level. It's impossible, that's where I wanted to use the word, impossible, to be 100% confident, 100% reliable, unless you test everything. That's not the point, you can't do that. So, ideally we have these AQL, acceptable quality limits, but we need to predetermine our risk. What's going to be acceptable to the consumer, what's going to be acceptable to the seller. They both have different starting points. And it's used as a reference point within your monitoring system, both internal and external. And reputable companies have very good internal mechanisms. And good regulatory authorities have a good external, a good regulatory monitoring system there. But this is what really happens. Sampling is based on what resources you've got, particularly in the regulatory system. You've got the laboratory and its capacity. You've got budget constraints. We heard earlier this week about lack of consumables. And the moment you train a person of staff, a member of staff, to use a particular piece of equipment, I can guarantee you that the private sector is going to steal them. I lost a LCMS inspector from the food laboratory in South Africa to a well-known beverage company that happens to sell in red cans. She was paid twice what the head of the food laboratory was earning. Okay? It was a no-brainer. She was going to go. And of course, what time is available? And I mean the time for the inspector. The inspector has got lots of things to do. He's got a wide range of issues to actually deal with. So, what happens is sampling gets carried out at market level, at point of sale. And this is where I have major, major problems. There's the chain of evidence. What's happened since time of production to the time of actually getting to that particular point of sale? there's counterfeiting. And if you're dealing with a product like I do, which is fortification of staple foods, we've got a homogeneity issue. And I'm going to show you examples of both of those. Now, this gentleman is very kindly helping to top up these containers. He's making sure that the product is level in each of them. Or as he, and we had this scandal in South Africa with olive oil. We heard in the States, right, they had this olive oil there in 2001 and then again in 2015. The simple addition of ethylene glycol, which is antifreeze, to sunflower oil, and you've got olive oil. Okay, I'm not going to tell you the formulations, okay, but you're clever enough, you can work this one out. So. The other is, there's the nice label. There's a 5 litre container, 3 litre container, and they've both got 5 litre labels on. Nice sealed containers. But there's the name and address. Guess who's going to get the blame? This little guy, there he is. He's helping. Let's look at homogeneity. A 10 tonne an hour wheat mill, and that's not big. You know, I deal with mills that go anywhere from about 2 tonnes an hour to somewhere in the order of about 100 tonnes an hour. But I'm going to deal with a very basic calculation, 75% extraction, that's 7,500 kgs per hour. That, by the way, is the brass weight kg, not the $20 million watt meter type kg, standard one. It's about 2 kilos a second it's coming off. And typically, right, remember your inspector's got no time. And he needs about 250, 500 grams, which he's going to send to the cell, which he's going to send to the laboratory. This is what happens when you are adding micronutrients to wheat flour or maize meal, as an example. We're adding it anywhere between 200 and 600 grams per metric ton. We're adding parts per million of iron, folic acid, parts per billion of vitamin B12, things like that. These top 2 pictures, there it is, the premix is coming out as a powder. Those pictures are taken 0.1 of a second apart. Bottom 2 pictures, it's coming out as a very, very fine mist. That makes it a little bit easier for me to be able to get something that is homogeneous, given a chance. But what causes this is something we don't know. I thought when I saw this, what happened was the guys had actually filled up the microfeeder. And I thought, this is it, I'm going to get the Nobel Prize for fortification here, because I've solved now the homogeneity problem. Came back to South Africa and found that 2 identical microfeeders performed in totally the opposite way. One of them worked nicely like this when it was at medium level, the other one worked better when it was at a high level. So what is a sample? And this is where we want to go back to some of my key words again. It is representative, shown as evidence of quality. Something that furnishes proof, specifically something legally submitted. Legally sufficient to establish a fact or a case unless disproved. I work with enough regulators, they can't read the unless disproved. Shorten it. Apparently if they've got evidence out of the laboratory, then that's it, case proven. Nobody goes back to argue. So say, nobody certainly queries the original sample which actually goes in. So by sample, what do I mean? How many? So I don't mean the quantity, I mean the number of samples. And this is going to come down to what is your level of risk. And you've got to decide this. So we can say that, right, the number of samples we want is going to be our prime determinant, because our inspectors are incredibly busy and they can't take 3-4 hours to do a representative sample out of the warehouse or off the production line. So there is a mathematical formula for doing this, as in always, and maths is a pure science. I had to get that one. I did do statistics, and I like quantum physics as well. So there's the formula. We take a k-value, we take the average of our results, take it against our specification limit, nearest one, divide by the standard deviation, and look up in a k-table. So I get a result of a k-value of 2.22. What does that mean? Well, if I've taken 12 samples, okay, I'm above there, that means I can be 95% confident that 90% of my product has passed. If I've taken only 8 samples, then I can only be 90% confident that 90% of it will pass. So, this is where our risk and our level of confidence need to be brought in. And this is where we start looking at risk analysis tables. Now, all of us here are dealing with different types of risk. I'm dealing with public health interventions in terms of supplying nutritious, safe food. Despite what people say about the risk of me over-adding micronutrients and poisoning the population with vitamin A and too much B and all of the rest of it, which, I'm sorry, at $85 a kg, I am not going to be over-adding. If anything, I've got to be watching the opposite end. So I'm a level 1. So I can work on an 85-85. There, acceptance criteria for attributes and variables. In the food industry, we are dealing with variables because we have got a very wide analytical error. The mathematicians are worried about the mathematical uncertainty of Planck's constants, which is what? 1.02 times 10 to the minus 8. That's the level of uncertainty. I'm dealing with vitamin A analysis, which at 2 standard deviations, 95% confidence, I've got a measurement uncertainty of 20% within one laboratory. When I've got half a dozen ISO 17025 laboratories all arguing about the same sample, I've got a different problem. Some of you, however, are dealing with very serious issues. And to be honest with you, if I'm looking at ready-to-use foods, like the peanut paste, things like that, which we feed to young babies when we're trying to get rid of acute malnutrition. I'm looking at a 0 salmonella in 650 grams. And my risk, 1 in 400 of those children are likely to die. And that's at 95-95. We can look and we can calculate this. How you determine what your confidence and what your reliability is. This is straight. You just, when you switch on your calculator in Windows, just click across, get a natural log, and you can do the calculation. And I've got this as a very simple spreadsheet, which you're all welcome to have. I will give it to the organisers. You plug in your own numbers, and then it will come up with the number of samples that you want, that you should be taking. Excel is also extremely reliable, and if you're like me and only use maybe 30, 40, 50% of Excel, then it's really worth going on some of these courses to find out some of these other numbers. But they have got a beta inverse function, and that brings out your one-tailed binomial. It is it's ideal because the commercial tables which are available, even the MIL ones, developed in the 1940s by the American military, don't really go down below the 90% confidence level. So you can put these numbers in, and this is what happens. There's our number of samples, here's our number of failures, and this is our reliability. So, everybody wants quick and reliable tests. Alright, so I'm going to take 3 samples, I'm going to get no failure, and it's 50% reliable. Heads or tails? That's it, that was 50% reliable. I've just saved you 3 analyses and an awful lot of time. The result was just as reliable. This is why, and unfortunately inspectors don't get this because they don't have the time. But this is why when we're actually looking at legal situations and people are relying on the results which are coming out of your laboratories, and please don't give me my vitamin A to 2 decimal places, okay? It happens, okay? This is why you need, now I'm not saying you have to analyse all 12. You can make a composite sample of that 12, or you could do stratified analysis within that. But at least give me, from the industry side, a chance of actually doing something with that. So, I'm going to conclude. I've rushed it through because we need to catch up and I need a cup of tea. You can read this yourself. You are the ones who actually are the one who should be guiding who gives the sample to you. In the laboratories, you should be telling them. I go to a facility in Israel, which the government actually pays, and I know that's an oxymoron, okay? But the government actually pays the laboratory to go out and do the analysis, to go out and do the sampling for them. So they go out and they make sure they get that sample right. It's only on water analysis, but at least it's something which they are getting right all of the time. You will find that right K tables are a little bit limited, but the beta inverse function, that will help you a great deal. There you go, it's there. The risk, and then the stakeholder choosing. You need to have risk, you need to know your confidence limits. You need to be able to then assess that and say, this is what I want the laboratory to do. As most people in industry do not have that capability, and I'm not talking the larger companies who happen to be sponsoring a great deal of what's actually going on here. I'm talking about the type of company that's your bread and butter in sending in samples to you. You need to be advising them on what constitutes a sample. Thank you very much.
Okay, once more, let's give them a round of applause. The next presenter, this is a very highly packed session. I know people are starting getting tired, but we have only 2 presentations remaining. Yes. The next presenter is Mr. Shubesho Helbro. He'll also be talking about sampling and the sampling plan. And I want to introduce him. If you are not intimately involved in the agriculture or shipping industry, then you might not be familiar with Shubesho. He is the man who is responsible for ensuring national export compliance with the food and maritime safety in South Africa. He is the program manager at the Perishable Product Export Control Board, commonly known as the PPECB. He has done 2 years in experience in agriculture, which has provided him with plenty of opportunities to contribute accordingly. As a result of an ever-changing legislative landscape, he successfully implemented the Safety of Life at Sea SOLAS regulatory requirements in South Africa. Changes in the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA, in the United States of America provided him with an opportunity to serve as a South African representative on the Science and Technology Committee of the Produce Marketing Association. Join me in inviting to make his presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for that warm introduction. I must add that whenever the opportunity presents itself to present something which can contribute to the greater good of society and globally, where I find myself, it is always very exciting. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to create awareness about what the PPCB does with regards to sampling and sampling plans, especially from a regulatory perspective. I would like to start off by sharing the following quote with you. John Wayne once said, "Talk low, talk slow, and don't say too much." Absolutely a challenging statement to make. However, he was not aware of the fact that somebody will have to talk about what is happening in a landscape which consists of a coastline of more or less 2,500 kilometers and a geographical surface area of roughly 1.2 million square kilometers, which stretch from the Lowveld right down to the Little Karoo, and it includes the Namakwa land. I will be talking about the BPECB and also sharing with you about what the Food and Maritime Safety Program is about. Then I will be touching on sample volumes, the testing sites involved, and also briefly touch on the components of the sampling plan. I will share with you the national challenges that we as a country faces when it comes to collecting regulatory samples for the analysis of the presence of crop protection substances, and then I will conclude. Now, the PPCB has been around since 1926, very close to 100 years. It's a national public entity acting in accordance with the PPCB Act number 9, and it's responsible under that Act for statutory cold chain services. The PPCB is also appointed by the Department of Agriculture to look at quality inspection and food safety certification services in accordance with the APS Act. Most recently, as far back as 2016, the PPCB was also appointed as an assignee by SAMHSA to look at maritime safety associated certification services in terms of the SOLAS regulations. Those regulations were amended in 2016. Now, the PPCB does have a geographical footprint which spans across all the provinces in the country, and it is represented by regional offices, which is furthermore supported by sub-regional offices within the production regions of South Africa. The food safety program is mandated in terms of regulation R707, and it services 4,500 food business operators across South Africa, which handles plus minus 53 different product categories. The audit scope includes the regulated crop protection substances, the use thereof. The Maritime Safety Program, as I've said, mandated in terms of the SOLAS regulations, and we service 134 exporters and 400 subcontractors, also otherwise known as loading points, from which they stuff their containers for export with the relevant fresh produce. From a volume perspective and point of origin within the context of the geographical area as earlier shared, I would like to focus your attention on the Citrus Gulf region, which is one of the biggest contributors of regulatory compliance samples. The Citrus Gulf region consists of the Northern Cape, which is known for its production of table grapes and also raisins. It also includes the production regions in the Western Cape, which makes up Glenwilliam, which is known for its rooibos tea, and also consists of production units producing citrus and grapes. The Eastern Cape contribute percentage-wise an equal amount of samples for analysis. However, it only specializes in citrus and a reasonable amount of deciduous fruit, which includes apples and pears. Now, when the PPCB inspectorate collect these samples, obviously these samples must end up at respective testing sites. We make use, in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, of a network of laboratories, all of them which are accredited. We have 4 analytical laboratories in the Western Cape. 1 is a government and 3 are commercial laboratories, and we have 2 analytical laboratories in the north. Obviously, when one prepared to collect a vast number of samples spread across a vast geographical space, you need to have a plan. Now, a typical sampling plan consider the amount of sampling points across the country. There are roughly about 1,500 to 2,000 sampling points across South Africa. The type of product is also important to consider, and the frequency of sampling. Frequency of sampling, as far as PPCB is concerned, and the standard operating procedure which we act according to, allows us to sample at the beginning of the season from each food business operator, whether it be citrus, apples or pears, and every 3 weeks thereafter until the season is finished, or at least twice per season if it is a short season for that specific food business operator. Then the sampling plan obviously also consider the associated risks. For example, in the citrus fraternity, some of the risks that is trending relates to imazolol exceedances. The seasonal crop volumes also play an important role because that talks directly to the capacity of these respective laboratories. The capability of these laboratories to test these specific products is also important to consider. Then the distance that the sample need to travel from the food business operator site, whether it's the farm or the pack house, to the respective laboratory, also impact the type of courier service, the service level agreement that has been signed off between the respective food business operator or between the laboratory and the courier service. That also impacts the outcome that we want to achieve. And lastly, we look at the capacity, turnaround time and accreditation status of the laboratory. Now obviously you will agree with me that within such a vast landscape, having to consider such numerous elements to make up a plan, there will be challenges. I would like to highlight to you a few of these challenges. First, obviously the crop volumes. When we experience bumper seasons, then by default, further down the line, some laboratories will experience turnaround time issues. The courier service, in terms of their ability to deliver the sample from point of origin to the laboratory, either same day, overnight, or the next day, also impacts the outcome and the turnaround of the results. The unauthorized testing for certain actives with regard to specific products also pose a challenge, especially when it comes to special market programs within the export market in the South African landscape. Now, timing, sampling, dispatching, and the arrival of the sample also pose their unique challenge. What is important for the exporter is to receive the results back from the laboratory within the respective turnaround time as prescribed by the standard operating procedure under which the exporter produced the produce for the export market. Now, the time provides me unfortunately with a limit. There are obviously much more other challenges that we can deliberate upon, but for the purpose of this session, I would like to focus your attention on those key challenges that is embedded in the landscape. Lastly, customer account status, believe it or not, provides also its unique challenge when it comes to accessing the results in order to provide export certification for the respective food business operators. Now, having said all of that, I would like to conclude to draw our attention to the fact that you've been giving me the opportunity to create the awareness of what is challenging us in the vast landscape when it comes to collecting samples. We must at all times strive to be aware of what is happening around us holistically. In my opinion, that will enable us to better collaborate and to improve on the quality of the service that we are delivering, and therefore enable us to assure food safety, public health, and trade. And on that note, I thank you kindly for your attention. Thank you.
The last presenter is Dr. Ramai Neka. She'll be talking about sampling and testing for mycotoxins in groundnuts in a nutshell. She has a master's in business leadership and a doctorate of philosophy in environmental mycotoxicology. She served as a manager in both the veterinary and agro-processing sectors and currently manages a competence area of pioneering healthy sciences at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, where her focus is to produce innovative products and services to support rapid and affordable food safety testing from farm to fork. She is a member of the board of the National Laboratory Association of South Africa, where she engages the needs of the testing industry in South Africa that services food, water, energy, civil engineering, and standard compliance markets. She sits on the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry Food Safety Forum engaging the agriculture, DOH and commercial sector, which includes decidual, citrus, grain and groundnut industries in particular. She has spent 5 years in a senior management role at the Agricultural Research Council in the Onderstepoort Veterinary Institute, where she engaged veterinarians and was responsible for our facility and its projects that supported veterinary toxicology testing and innovative technology development. The NEPANT Southern African Network for Biosciences, SABIO, provides a shared research, development and innovative platform for collaborative research in health and nutrition. She is currently employed by CSIR and represents the Biosciences Hub through Sunbio, where she engages the Southern African Network of Biosciences in SANDAC to strengthen relations between South African scientists and scientists from the region. Join me in welcoming
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's almost afternoon. I'm standing between you and a nice cup of tea, so I'm going to be very quick, not talking low, not talking slowly. I'm glad that the room is still full, and I was anxious that I was going to see a lot of hot air balloons this morning with an empty venue. Anyway, I want to thank Jane and Ephraim from the AOAC in particular for inviting me. We've had individual engagements during the year, brainstorming sessions on innovative food safety technologies that we could implement in South Africa and in the region. And I'm hoping that this platform will allow us to strengthen that relationship with the broader AOAC community. And thank you for inviting me on behalf of the CSIR. I wear that hat today. And I'm hoping my presentation is going to be very short and quick. I want us to engage further outside this platform on collaborations and how the CSIR can actually position itself to support the AOAC membership. Safety and testing of mycotoxins in groundnuts in a nutshell, and the role of the CSIR. The previous speaker, Mr. Shibesco Helbron, is actually a former colleague. I come from the PPCB, where I spent many years working on that industry in particular. But now I continue to support the industry by looking at how we can implement innovative food safety technologies so that the results continue to be rapid, reliable, and accurate. Please bear with me. I just want to share with you a few facts around the CSIR. I don't know if you know the organization well enough, but there are many colleagues I've met here who are prior colleagues of the CSIR. It's a national government entity. It reports to the Department of Science and Technology. It sits down the road, just as you enter Linwood. It's a mandate-driven organization, so we are mandated to conduct directed research and innovation to contribute to the socio-economic development of the country. I come from the CSR Biosciences, and our focus there is on innovative food safety technologies and how we support laboratories locally and in the region. We have a national footprint, and our head office is here in Pretoria. So the CSIR has about 1,800 set staff. 317 of those are PhDs. They span a whole range of technical expertise from different types of engineering to biochemists, biologists, molecular biologists, and so we have a wealth of knowledge that can actually support innovation in the food space. A lot of our technologies are technology pull, so we liaise a lot with industry, looking at what their demands and needs are, and we align our research to their needs. In the last year, we've had 60 new technology demonstrators along the technology readiness level evaluation plan, meaning that these technologies are ready at prototype level for testing for industry need. And we've had about, get my notes, a few publications, 300 and some odd publications. Let me see, is that right? Okay, you can Google our website and you'll find all those specific details on what the CSR is about. 40% of our support comes from the Department of Science and Technology, and 60% of it is through contract R&D that we need to secure and licenses and royalties that we earn. So these are the major impact areas of the CSIR: health and nutrition, energy, the natural environment, aerospace industry, the built environment. Currently we're looking at better train bus routes, for example, feasibility studies. We work a lot with the municipalities, looking at the impact of the implementation of their projects, defense and security, and health and nutrition, which is where food safety sits. Okay, so we are, as I said, we are mandate driven. So if you allow me a few minutes to talk about the SAN-BIO, the Southern African Network for Biosciences. It's a new partnership for Africa's development to accelerate Africa's regional and continental integration by 2018. So the CSR hosts SAN-BIO, which facilitates training in the region, facilitates the coordination of funding that they secure to support projects in the region. And one of the calls is currently out there, and I hope you will Google the SAN-BIO, is the mobility grant. It currently closes at the end of December. It's a grant that allows researchers, particularly from SADC, to engage and have workshops anywhere on the globe in the field of biosciences. And it ranges from 25 to 35,000 Rand. The call is open to the end of December. So I encourage you to please look at that if you see there's opportunities for you to travel, and this is the funding opportunity. It's, the funding comes from the Finnish government, so it's a BioFisa program currently and supported by the DST. So I'm the liaison for the SAN-BIO hub and the CSIR, where we're looking at leveraging CSIR competencies to support the region. So we do a lot of training in the region using our technologies, and we also bring in other experts in related fields to support various training initiatives. Okay. So 2 examples of projects that we are working on that have been funded by BioFisa is foot and mouth disease. It's a diagnostic kit that we're looking at producing a testing kit for foot and mouth, African strains. Currently, the project team is led by Dr. Piani Lebia. He sits in my area, and he goes into the region, Zambia, Rwanda in particular, and conducts on-site trials. His project was R1 million. It was funded through the BioFisa program. The BioFisa program requires a South African partner with collaborating with a SADC regional partner. A second project is the Nutri-Drink from Indigenous Food Ingredients, and Dr. Namusa Dlamini, who will be here tomorrow, is one of the leaders, is the principal investigator on this specific project. She partnered with an SMME who is looking at evaluating the technology for the Nutri-Drink. The Nutri-Drink is a green leafy vegetable type drink, and it was conceptualized at the CSIR. So those are just examples of projects that we are involved in. Okay, as I said, the mobility grant is an open call. So currently at the CSR, we are positioning ourselves to align to the 4th Industrial Revolution, which is characterized by new technologies that are connecting the physical, digital, and biological worlds and impacting all disciplines, economies, and industries. So our understanding and the objectives of innovation in food safety testing in Africa is to continually improve technology and testing to support the food safety testing programs, to provide an ISO 17025 accredited testing service for products, to increase the scope of analyses to meet customer needs through PT schemes, certified reference material and testing, and to deliver a statutory and commercial service to ensure compliance to standards and to strengthen core competencies of said staff. This is something we discussed with the panel yesterday on how do we ensure capacity building. So many of our projects involve student participation in universities. And also we want to reduce the lead times to optimize the workflow processes and invest in the R&D and infrastructure to support in-house developed product conformity testing and to support the industry needs in terms of regulatory conformity. So for Biosciences, we are focused on health, agriculture, and industrial biotechnology. One of our main priorities is to reduce the disease pathogen identification from days to minutes at point of care. And another interesting aspect for us is to look at how we valorize natural-based products in local nutrition and the cosmetic industries. Okay. So we aim to use our innovative and best-in-class knowledge-based life sciences tools and our proprietary technologies and know-how in many of the projects that we undertake. So when it comes to the food safety testing landscape, this is readily available. You would have seen some of the latest food safety testing reports that are available, that mycotoxin testing, pesticide testing, and pathogen testing is still the forerunners in terms of the need globally. So for us at the CSR, we don't do these type of projects alone. Currently, one of our strongest and most important partners is the National Metrology Institute of South Africa. We are working together to address the issues around mycotoxins. We are not developing new tests. We want to support laboratories that are involved in this type of testing. One of our projects is to produce standards, mycotoxin standards, locally for the South African and African markets in particular. So we know the economic impact of mycotoxins, and in the South African context, government is taking this seriously. We have regulations and acts that come out through DAF, DOH, DST, on how we need to address the issues around residues. Shibesco pointed out on the Agricultural Product Standards Act that the DAF is the custodian of. It regulates the sale and export of specific agricultural products, and the groundnuts fall in this. The Foodstuffs and Cosmetics and Disinfectants Act by the Department of Health stipulates the maximum tolerable level of mycotoxin in certain foods. And then you have the bioeconomy strategy of the Department of Science and Technology that we are aligned to. Here, the strategy clearly states that we need to look at an integrated food nutrition research program, where research in the nutritional composition of food and the detection and elimination of contaminants is being promoted. And obviously working with NAMISA, who NAMISA reports to the Department of Trade and Industry. So all the relevant departments are involved. So again, these are the regulations, and I just want to focus on what we are doing as on the production of standards, the mycotoxin standards. For those of us who are involved and have been involved in routinized mycotoxin testing, procuring the standards are very, very expensive. Turnaround times can take months, and the quality of the standards can also be questionable. So together with NAMISA, we are looking at producing the standards for the local and the markets. But the value proposition here is that we want to produce standards that are greater than 99% pure. And currently that's where we are focusing our energies together in this collaboration. Angelique spoke about CRM, so I'm not going to address that. So what are the other potential new R&D currently at the CSIR? We are looking at using some of our innovative technologies to produce new mycotoxin or innovative mycotoxin testing tools. One of them is the lateral flow test, using our in-house developed resin microsphere beads. These beads have a larger surface area, more porous, and they're more sensitive than the conventional affinity beads in the market today. We are looking at applying that to the lateral flow test that can replace the imports. We're also looking at producing mycotoxin antibodies using plant-based expression systems, and we have those technologies in-house. And then also producing these mycotoxin standards. And then the objective is to find interested industry partners for commercialization of these mycotoxin testing tools. The differentiator of our technologies is obviously the first platform in South Africa where we will look to produce and supply these standards. It will be easily accessible to the region, And obviously, turnaround times for procuring the standards will be reduced. We're aiming to produce standards of greater than 99% purity, so quality standards that can be tested against other products in the market, and we envisage that it's going to be cost effective. Peanuts, I'm not going to go too much into detail around the peanuts, but we've seen some recalls on mycotoxins in peanuts. 2 laboratories in the country that I want to mention who are forerunners in mycotoxin testing are firstly the PPECB laboratory. Hein, can you stand up? Hein Engelbert is the lab supervisor of the PPECB laboratory. So in their discussions around mycotoxin testing, he has a wealth of experience in that space. And the second lab is the South African Grain Laboratories. Vienna, can you, or do you need no introduction? Those are the 2 leading labs in the country with respect to mycotoxin testing, and accredited laboratories producing reliable, accurate results and timelessly to support this market in particular. Okay. So I'm just not going to go into this, as you find this in the literature, but 2 years ago, many years ago, I attended the international conference on peanuts in Amsterdam. It was very interesting that they wanted us to promote the health benefits of peanuts, and many articles were presented. And also the issue around the maximum tolerable level for aflatoxins in peanuts. India was making the case for Europe applying Codex as opposed to their own EU regulation on limits on aflatoxins. So it was quite an interesting meeting, and the objective was for us to go back and promote the health benefits of peanuts. In South Africa, it is a minor crop. And there were some interesting articles on red meat consumption. It's more affordable to replace red meat with nuts, for example, and nut consumption is associated with decreased health risk factors. So that was quite interesting, and there are many articles out there advocating consumption of peanuts. I still engage the Groundnut Forum. We look at mobilizing to market the health benefits of peanuts. For the South African export market, it's been stagnant over the last few years in terms of the export volumes, but our imports are predominantly from Argentina. And the areas where you would, as Shubesco said, the regional, the complexity of sampling from the different areas and bringing samples to central laboratories is very challenging. And I had the privilege of being audited by the Food and Veterinary Office of the EU when at the PPECB, and they complemented the sampling procedures and of the complex 20 kilogram sample that would come to the laboratory. And I still quote today the comment from the technical auditor assessor who said it's one of the best processes he had seen in the world in terms of homogenizing a 20 kg sample for mycotoxin testing by the PPECB. Sampling and testing, we are guided by the standard operating procedures from DAF. These processes have been audited and are deemed reliable. So PPECB plays that statutory role, and they have their own laboratory for analysis and export certification. So I'm not going to go into that. And obviously, I just want to conclude by saying that in South Africa, our main product is that we enjoy is peanut butter.
Applause for all the presenters. Okay. We are going to take a few questions from all the presenters. Yes. So.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Peter Mutuku. I represent Healthcare Biosystems. We distribute aflatoxin testing kits within East Africa. My question goes to the last presenter. You are talking of lateral flow devices for testing of mycotoxin. So at what level are you going to do the lateral flow? Is it laboratory level or at the farm level? The lateral flow devices you want to start using.
Can you hear me? So our objective is to look at what the minimum requirements and the maximum level of detection is according to regulations. So we know at 5 parts per billion aflatoxin B1, that's the highest you can get. That's our target. Those are the levels we are looking for. So it's not only, it's going to be more of a semi-quantitative test.
Will it be at the farm level or will it be at your laboratory?
So we want to have a point of so it's a field testing. So we want to get to the farmer, to the pack house.
So that's the farm.
Yes.
Farm level.
Yes. So it's
not in the laboratory.
no, it's not for the laboratory. So we want to have this accessible for a small to medium enterprise. A rural farmer, can he understand how to use a lateral flow test on his farm at site? So it's more of field testing. Yes.
Next question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Marcel Bonny from our Biofarm, and we are developing methods for sure, and we are all type of them, and we are also validating them with AOAC and other organizations, and we are also providing proficiency testing. I would like to thank all presenters this morning. Also a special thank to Dr. Landa for speaking of sampling, because sometimes we forget it, and I used to say very often, look, better not to do tests if you just make one sample. And I think we clearly understood why. Okay. My question is not to one or two persons, it's all for the presenter. It's about speaking of food safety, speaking of risk, and speaking of trade. What would be your way forward to, let's say, develop method, validate method, and also for proficiency testing? In other words, on which base are you going to start to implement at a continental level, possibly a sort of way forward? Will you have data for that? What will be the driving force to start?
You want a response to that question first? Who to respond? Mary? Want to try? The way forward. Yes, she can. Okay.
Okay.
Either.
Okay.
So with respect to our tests, we obviously will have to go through the whole process of method validation, which is critical. We also work with the National Metrology Institute. So the National Metrology Institute also have a set of procedures on how they will validate, for example, the standard, the lateral flow test, to deem it reliable and accurate.
Okay. That's great.
So we also have our quality assurance and quality controls in place to ensure that we test.
You want to add something?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you for the very comprehensive question. I think it really depends on the analyte that you're talking about. Obviously, the regulatory framework, which it's regulated. I would say in terms of validation, though, at a global levels, we're working diligently to harmonize these guidelines as much as possible, so we really have an overlap of the requirements and the performance criteria, regardless of where we are, for pathogens and quantitative tests on the micro side. But we have a lot of work to do, looking at how we can validate a certain product using one set of criteria is really where the ultimate goal is. But the regulators within the specific countries have a lot to do with that. So I think that's a topic, would be a topic in and of itself for a 3-day conference.
Okay, thank you.
So
sorry, not to be long, but I think in Abidjan, where we were, we started to try to understand the case and the risk, and we started to list, what would make sense, especially on matrix, for which there is no method for Africa, to really start to work on method. And I think it would be good to have the feedback of this group in Abidjan. We were part of them, and I think it would be very good that this is communicated. Just one point for you about lateral flow. Yes, it's qualitative, but it also can be quantitative, and that's relatively recent. But now you can measure a bound compared to an internal standard, especially with a new technology. You spoke of beads, and it's amazing how you can get good correlation with ELISA and also a reference method like HPLC. So I think even for the farmer, it's good to know if you are at 4 ppb or 2 ppb or 7 more, so lateral flow are not only qualitative.
Yeah, just a quick comment on how far we in Africa. Africa is very big, as you know. So what you have asked has been done for Southern Africa. We already have the methods, validated everything, doing the testing, a lot of training has been done in countries like Malawi, Zambia. For West Africa, it is a challenge. The problem for us is, of course, the language. Est-ce que vous parlez français? Oui. So it is a bit of a problem, and we are working towards improving the communication with Western Africa. We've got great interest from Ghana at the moment, so we're working with them on microtoxin analysis. And we had contact with the Burkina Faso and the Suamed region, but that is still a challenge, and I would like to speak to you to see if we can communicate better to them. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Geoffrey. Just to respond to the comment by Marcel. So this afternoon we will be having a review of those results from the workshops we've held in West Africa, but also results from the activities on analytical method alignment from 2017 we had in Johannesburg as well. But our view is that one way forward is to actually share the methods we're using for different matrices, for specific analytes, and this will give us a lot more information which will enable us to identify where the risks are in terms of competence, in terms of the needs for method development. And also, it's information that's relevant so that you don't go and try to reinvent the wheel. There are methods that perhaps are out there that you're not aware of. You may not be aware of the performance challenges with the specific matrices, but maybe there are others who have already done it. Therefore, you don't need to invest time and money in that. So I think this afternoon we hope we can get a very good discussion around this topic of sharing of analytical methods and really building this platform, which we will talk a lot more about. Thanks very much.
Another question, the last one, on this side.
Thank you very much. My question would go to Boda from National Metrology Institute. It is good to note that you are doing some work in coming up with certified reference methods, but I just needed to know how much it costs to get one. And even though we are talking about getting African matrices, is it feasible to be able to get all matrices that you will ever come across, given the diversity of African foods as far as reference materials are concerned? Thank you.
I'll answer that. I'm Maria Fernandez-Wady. I'm the Reference Material Program Manager at the NMISA, and we are working on the collaborative project with CSIR Biosciences on the mycotoxin calibrators, but also on the matrix reference material production. And we see this as an opportunity to collaborate with all our African partners across the continent to develop these matrix reference materials. We know they are diverse, and not for 1 second do we think we're the experts on testing those materials for those specific parameters. That's why we invite all our African countries to collaborate with us on these projects to develop these reference materials. So collaboration in the sense of, maybe we will develop that method from scratch, or the AOAC, or within the AOAC network, we can collaborate with the experts on the development of methods to value assign those materials, but let's work together to make those materials. In terms of cost, it really was one of the motivating factors for us to establish the reference material production facility, because we are slaves to the foreign exchange. When you're in a developing economy, it made sense that the cost of production and labor in developing economies is much lower. Therefore, the products that we produce will be significantly more affordable within our area. And that was one of the main aims of producing reference materials locally, was to make them affordable and accessible. But in terms of producing them and within that diversity, yes, we want to work together with you. We don't want to try and reinvent the wheel or try and figure it all out ourselves. We want to use this vast network of collaborators and experts that we have through the AOAC, SSA, and with the different countries and the materials that you have in those countries. Let's work together, come to our facility, use our equipment, let's do those measurements together, let's produce those materials together. I hope that answers your questions.